Which Houston Astros prospects might help this team in 2024? Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On MLB Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on in to Locked On MLB Prospects, your home for all things minor league baseball. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen every single day. We're proudly part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. And today's episode is made possible by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Bringing you a fun conversation today. Hopped on with Brett Chancey of Locked On Astros to talk about some Astros prospects in 2024. Who might you see at the major league level? Who's probably not necessarily ready? And we went so long on position players, we never even got to discussing my take of liking Alonzo Treadwell more than Spencer Arrighetti. I'll probably throw that into Monday's mailbag. But without further ado, it's me, Brett Chancey of Locked On Astros. Enjoy.
Man, there's a lot of stuff going on. There are moves, there are signings, there are crazy contracts, but we're here to focus on the Astros of tomorrow because a lot of people feel like this championship window is closing. And whether it's closing or open for another couple of years, that's not really for us to debate right now. But it really makes you wonder, what is the future? Because we hear how thin the prospect pool is. We do know the two years of first and second round picks being stripped from the Astros has really taken effect. You really see the disservice that's done to being able to grow the farm system with top prospects. Of course, some trades had depleted it here and there. But Lindsay, let's start with position players. The Astros, even though they're on the bottom, they do still have some solid guys in positions. Who is out there that you like that's in the Astros organization right now?
So I think he's the number one prospect for a reason, but outfielder Jacob Melton gets a lot of the attention, and I think deservedly so. Second rounder in 2022 out of Oregon State, and I had the pleasure of watching him just absolutely rake against my Auburn Tigers in a super regional that year. That was tons of fun. But if you look at what he did last year, 23 home runs and 41 extra base hits over the course of his just under 100 games between high A and double A. And he's a guy that when you watch him, it's a little bit frustrating, right? Because it's a weird swing, okay? In the scouting reports, they're nicer, right? They say highly unusual or unorthodox, but he's got a lot of stuff going on, a big leg kick. He's kind of closed off, but it works, right? I am firmly of the opinion, and everydayers who listen to Locked On MLB Prospects have heard this, hitters are born, not made. And it's something where, it works, right? It doesn't look right. It doesn't look normal, but he does not miss hittable pitches. And so you can't really change it. The statistical results were a little bit weird last year, right? He batted .245 with a .467 slug, and I think he can do a little bit better than that. But the power's really good for Jacob Melton. His 90th percentile exit velocity was 106. We're looking for, usually on a 90th percentile exit velocity, we're looking for 101 to 102 or so to know that you have at least average power. So he's got above average power. He does a really good job when he pulls the ball. And then speed-wise, he's not an absolute burner, but he's got plus speed. He stole 46 bags last year in 53 tries. Wow. Despite not having absurd speed, it still works out. The question that I have is, defensively, does he play in center, or does a better defender come along that eventually kicks him out to a corner? Because I think if he plays in center field, he's going to be fine. He's going to be average to above average defensively in center, but he's just at that level of there may be somebody better than him that could make him move. And if he has to move, he's going to be, he could play left or right. His arm isn't really an asset, but it's not a detriment. But he's going to be like a plus defender in a corner. In center, he's going to be average to above average. But either way, he looked like he it's a good combination of power and speed, and he feels like he could be, if everything broke right, a 20-20 guy, maybe a 25-25 guy, provided he can get a little bit better with, elevated fastballs, breaking pitches on the outer half of the plate and things like that.
Okay, yeah, and I know he's one of the guys. Obviously Melton and Gilbert were mentioned in a lot of the same conversations, and Gilbert went away in that trade, or Justin Verlander, and we're wondering, are we going to regret that? I think he's going to be one of those, the one that got away type of players, or so it seems at this point. That's if if the Mets can develop him. Now, going along these lines of guys that have been really targeted as the top guys, Zach Dezenzo is another guy that we are hearing a lot about, a third baseman, second baseman, made it all the way up to Double-A this last year. And he seemed to actually, he went from Asheville to Corpus. And he hit the ball really well. He hits a lot of extra base hits. Tell us about Dezenzo.
Yeah, he's kind of on the same timeline as Melton. They both were in high A to Double-A around the same time, got around the same number of games. They're probably going to debut somewhere near each other, depending on where there's an opening first. The thing with Dezenzo is the power's fantastic, right? 90th percentile exit velocity of 108. Okay, he hit, He hit 43 extra base hits last year. Now, to go along with that, he struck out 106 times in 94 games. So, little bit higher strikeout rate than you want, but for a corner infielder, and he is a corner infielder, and I think he's probably going to end up at first base, which is fine with this team because you need a first baseman, by the time he's up. It's something where you've got a little bit of issue with some of the launch angles. He keeps a lot of balls on the ground, it feels like, but he's not one of those natural hitters, right? He has to work at it. The actual pure ability to make contact with the ball is probably average, like fringe to average, but he makes up for that by the fact that he does not chase, right? Like he does not expand the zone. You have to attack him in the strike zone to have a chance to get him out. And so it's something where he cuts down on swing and miss, he cuts down on chase, and it gives him an opportunity to still be a decent bat. He batted .305 last year. And for a guy who doesn't have amazing, natural contact ability to bat .300, it tells you pitchers had to come into the zone against him. And that's where his power comes into play. I do also think he's surprisingly fast for his size. He's like 6'4", 225 or so. But, he stole 22 of 24 bags. He's not running recklessly, but he can steal the obvious bases. He can go first to third on a base hit, do the stuff you need him to do from a base running perspective. It's just defensively, the arm is above average, but the actions aren't great at third base. And defense does get better as you progress through the minors. You spend more time in professional baseball. Defense does get better. But from having watched him when he was in the South Atlantic League and things like South Atlantic League, I don't know if he's going to be able to stick at third. I think ultimately the best place for him is first base. But either way, he's there because of the bat and specifically the power in that bat, which is just great.
Awesome. Yeah, I love to hear that. And we're going to continue to talk about this. I want to ask you a couple more names before we get into the pitching, but first we're going to hear about FanDuel.
Back to our conversation with Brett in just a second, but first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Talking about the Houston Astros, so looking at the Astros odds on FanDuel as of time of recording, Wednesday afternoon on December 20th, they are plus 140 to win the American League West. The reigning World Series champions, Texas Rangers, are behind them at plus 170. And then the Seattle Mariners at plus 220, which, if we're being a little honest, feels a little high for Seattle based on what they've done this offseason compared to what everybody else has done. It feels like they've shed more guys than they've brought guys in and still have some offensive questions, especially at third base. But they did get rid of a lot of strikeouts by Teoscar leaving, by Eugenio Suarez going to Arizona, things like that. So, all that action and more available on FanDuel. It's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network.
All right. So look, man, it's always exciting to hear guys that have potential, and Dezenzo, of course, I know his name's been coming up with other people's names. Well, is Bregman going to sign? Is Bregman going to stay? And who's going to replace him? And, are we going to sign Tucker over Bregman? And maybe we bring you on for another episode, like, what you would do there, because to me, a corner infielder is more difficult to replace than a right fielder. Mm-hmm. But then you look at the right fielder, who Kyle Tucker is, and who's going to replace that offensive production. So there's definitely a lot. Now, as far as position players, before we get into pitchers, there are three names, and you can address these in just a microcosm type of way. But I know Luis Baez he's got a ton of hype about him. And then you have Joey Loperfido, who's my favorite guy in the minors. And then Brice Matthews gets talked about a lot too. Can you give us a little insight into these three guys and who is going to get here sooner out of these three that I just named?
Ooh, okay. The soonest one of those three feels like it's pretty easy to say Loperfido, simply because he made it to AAA last year. And when you look at the slash line, like it's really good. And the thing that I noticed when you go through the top of this system is a lot of these guys were not just by default first rounders. Dezenzo was a 12th rounder. Loperfido was a 7th. Looking at this, Will Wagner was an 18th rounder. Houston does a good job of taking guys who were drafted later in the draft and making them into legitimate prospects. But for Loperfido, the thing to me, when you watch what he did, 25 homers, 55 extra base hits, again, batted .278 last year across a couple different levels. You can see there's a lot of promising things to like, but he's not quite a complete package, okay? So when you watch, and I'm kind of throwing out that month at AAA. He really kind of struggled in AAA. He started pressing, he started chasing and things like that. And you see that sometimes with guys who get to AAA and they know that they're one heater away from making the bigs. They kind of press a little bit. But if you back up and look at the rest of the season for Joey Loperfido, he has some work to do as far as ground balls, right? When you're a lefty, you don't have the shift anymore, like a full shift, but you do have partial shifts, and he still hits too many ground balls. And so because of that, it kind of limits how effective his power can be. But you can see the power is there. The power potential, the home run potential is there if he can fix the launch angle stuff. And he does a really good job of not being too aggressive, but not being too passive. Something that we look at, especially with younger prospects in the lower level of the minors, is when they're hesitant to swing and they walk a lot, are they walking a lot because they know the opposing pitcher is bad and can't throw strikes? Or are they doing a good job of balancing hittable pitches? What do I swing at? What do I take? And Loperfido does a really good job of kind of walking that line where he's not concerned about letting a good pitch go for a great pitch. He'll swing at a hittable pitch, but he'll make quality contact. Yeah, so I like that. It feels like the swing's still a little bit. It's kind of like Jacob Melton. There's a little bit more stuff than you'd love. It's not as crazy as Melton's, but I like him. I think defensively, the big thing for Loperfido is his value is probably better as a super utility guy, right? Somebody like a Dubon who can play center, who can play second, who can play, a corner outfield, a corner infield, move around a lot of different places. And it's the issue with Loperfido is I don't think his arm is that great. And so the super utility profile works, but I don't know if you can play him on the left side of the infield. So you have second base, and then you have center field or left field, whatever it might be. But I don't know if you can use him consistently at third. And when you look at where he played last year, he played all three outfield spots. he played first, he played second. They didn't play him any at short or third, and I think it's because of that arm. So, I mean, could he eventually be a second base replacement for Jose Altuve? Eventually. I think Jose Altuve is probably an Astro for life, so there's no worries there. But I do think his best value is as a super utility guy who plays all over the diamond. And, I mean, it reminds me a bit of Jacob Melton as far as the power-speed combination, maybe not as potent, maybe 15-15 or 20-20 versus the 20-20 or 20-25 that Melton might be.
Okay.
But I do like Loperfido. Again, I think that if you stick him in one position, you kind of take away some of the value that he has as a super utility guy.
Right. And I've just always been impressed, especially with his background. We had the opportunity of interviewing him shortly after he was drafted by the Astros, and just, knowing that he brought Duke their first title. I mean, there's a lot of things that in his background that you can't replace other than by having that experience. So I think,
and the baseball instincts kind of come through on that, where, he's played baseball at such a high level for so long that he just understands the game. And that's why he's even able to go out there and play first and play second and the outfield in the same game and look competent. And I think that's one of his biggest strengths. And unfortunately, that's not something that comes out in a lot of scouting reports, but that's just like he's a ball player, and that's not something we can quantify with a grade, but he's a ball player.
So I want to go to Luis Baez next, because Luis Baez to me is a guy that I know we talked to Elvis Rodriguez, and Elvis Rodriguez actually is not with the Astros anymore. He's going to be coaching for the Cardinals now. He's going to be in their minor league system. And so I know him and Rafael Pena have exited. I think Pena went to the Phillies possibly. And so the Astros have lost a couple really big-time hitting instructors from the Dominican Summer League. But this guy has always talked about Luis Baez, has always talked about how good he is, how like the sky's the limit with him. And there's a lot of prospect people that mention you can't talk about Astros prospects without mentioning Luis Baez.
Yeah, and he feels like the ultimate decider on the ceiling is going to be how well he can adjust offensively to spin and especially sliders off the plate. Like he reminds me, I'm not giving a comp, we don't do comps on my show, but he reminds me of a guy like Yordan Alvarez, who you can play him in the outfield. His true best position is probably DH. I think Baez can stick longer in the outfield because his arm is so good. Like his speed is, fringe at best. The defensive ability for the most part is fringe at best, but the arm is so good that you can keep him in the outfield a little while longer simply because of that. But really, he's there because the power is very, very good. I mean, kind of just digging into some of the stats, hitting 27 extra base hits in like 50 games in rookie ball and A ball at his age as a 2022 international free agent. Fantastic. He has the potential to be a 30-35 home run guy, right? The question is, and this is common a lot when you watch young hitters, especially power hitters, you can get them with spin, specifically sliders that are down and away, breaking off the plate, things like that. So how well he adjusts to that as he moves up. And honestly, I want him to start in high A next year because I want him to face better pitchers that can more reliably locate breaking pitches, because I want him to recognize the slider off the plate and learn to lay off of that. Some guys learn it in the low minors. Some guys learn it in the high minors. Some guys learn it in MLB. I'm thinking about Austin Riley. Some guys never learn it. And I think the sooner he can learn to lay off that outside slider, make them throw him something that is over the plate on the inner third, he can pull and just launch for a 500-foot home run, the better he will be and the better the Astros will be. But I like his future, provided that you can make that adjustment, and that's a big adjustment to make.
Yeah, that is, and that's always a thing. And I don't know that we'll get to him per se, but that's always a thing with guys like Pedro Leon, and you talked about natural hitters versus, like a learned hitter. Not everybody has a natural hit tool. And when, I think it's funny when someone criticizes major league players like, well, he can't hit worth what. And I'm like, well, you do know how hard it is to hit the baseball. Just because you're a baseball player doesn't mean you're a great hitter. But what we'll do is we'll talk about one or two other position guys, and then we'll go on to the pitching here next. So you've given us an insight on Luis Baez, given us some insight on some other guys. Brice Matthews is an interesting person because, he comes out of Nebraska, highly touted as a shortstop. His arrival time says 2026, so he's a little bit further out. He's probably maybe a little bit before Baez, unless Baez breaks through. But what do you like about Brice Matthews? He's a shortstop. I know that's where Jeremy Pena is right now, but is there a possibility of someone like this being talented enough to play another position, or is he a shortstop and that's who he's going to be?
So defensively, I think he could be above average at shortstop. The limiting factor is going to end up being his arm strength. And you can be a shortstop, a good shortstop, and not have great arm strength. Dansby Swanson's a great example of that. But I ultimately think that given the fact that Jeremy Pena is so good at shortstop and is kind of entrenched, you're looking at a scenario where he can't kick out to third because of that arm. So he either would kick into second, where Jose Altuve is, or I do think, and there's a couple scouts that I've talked to that also agree with this, that he could play center field. 6 foot 175, good speed. I'd say it's above average speed. And so the ground he covers, and then you can kind of mitigate the arm only being fringe to average in the outfield. Another thing where power is probably above average, the hit tool, not a natural hitter. He makes it work because he's very, very selective. Kind of like Zach Dezenzo. Doesn't chase a lot. You have to attack him in the zone. Now, if it's in the zone, he's going to swing. He will swing at just about everything that's over the plate, but it has to be over the plate to get him to swing, and that's the differentiating factor. So if you throw him a pitch on the inner third, you are screwed. He is going to hit that for a home run. He's really good at pulling that fastball in for a home run. Again, I think he could stick it short because Jeremy Pena's there. He's not going to supplant Pena. He would have to kick inside, and if Altuve's still there, you're going to look at him having to kick out to center field, which might work out in the end. But I do think that power-wise, 15-15, 20-20, not out of the realm of possibility for Brice Matthews. He actually had the first 2020 season in Nebraska history, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, I saw that. And, just a little factoid about Brice Matthews is he was an all-state quarterback. And in his senior year in high school, he threw for 54 touchdowns. So, that having that arm there, having that football background might help a little bit. But, the scouting report per the Astros website is exactly what you said it was. He has a permit. He's kind of prone to swing and miss, but he's swinging at, stuff over the plate. And also his defense and arm are, kind of average. But I have a question about arm strength. Is arm strength something you can gain, or do you either have it like a Carlos Correa or you don't? You know what I'm saying? What is that something that these players can develop? Because I don't know if all our people watching know these things.
So I would say if you're looking at a prospect, there's two ways that you can improve your arm strength. And one is if you're looking at a prep prospect, as they gain natural strength, as they go through those, age 19 through 21 years, they're going to get a naturally stronger arm as they gain strength. But then two, you can do biomechanical work to kind of get the most efficiency out of your existing movements. And I think about not everybody's fan here in Houston, but like Anthony Volpe of the New York Yankees. He's a guy who doesn't have an amazing arm. I'd call it similar to Brice Matthews, but he went to a biomechanical lab and got more efficient with his arm movement to get to the point where his arm was not a detriment at shortstop. So you could probably bump it a half grade by just getting more efficient with your movements. So a 45 to a 50, a 40 to a 45. I think for Matthews, he could get it to the point where he'd probably be average with arm strength, but it's hard to go past that for a guy who's already 22, 23 years old. So a half grade's reasonable.
So with all these things, with these position players, with these pitchers and all this stuff going on, and we don't know who they're going to re-sign and all that stuff, what do you think the system outlook is for this Houston Astros team? Do you think that we're just going to have to let Dana Brown cook and we're going to have to let him do his thing because it's going to take a couple years? Or do we think we see some things come to fruition like we have with some budding stars like a Garcia or Javier, guys like that?
So having watched Dana Brown in Atlanta, I'm going to say let Dana Brown cook. What Dana Brown is very good at doing, one, you already touched on it, very good at getting those dual sport athletes, right? Like something you saw a lot of Atlanta's drafts had dual sport athletes, very good at getting the athletic guys and then finding ways to lean into the organization's strengths. And I'm going to point out that you guys have had done a really good job of developing international pitchers and getting them to the majors, a Valdez, a Javier, things like that. And so expect Dana Brown to spend the next couple years leaning into what the organization does well and getting you the assets where if you don't have a prospect to promote into an open spot, you have the prospect capital to make a trade to get a guy to put into the open spot. So I feel really good about Dana Brown running the Astros simply because I felt really good about Dana Brown being in charge of a lot of the scouting and the drafting with the Atlanta Braves and just seeing how that paid off for them. I will say when you look at the pitching, I do think there needs to be a little bit more of an investment in pitching in the organization. You've got a couple pitchers in the top 10. Spencer Arrighetti's the guy that folks always seem to talk about. I like Alonzo Treadwell better than Spencer Arrighetti simply because of the ceilings of each one of the guys. But I do trust Dana Brown to invest more in the arms because it's harder and you need more pitchers than you need necessarily bench pieces or backup position players. So be on the lookout for that. I feel like some of the upcoming drafts are going to be weighted a little heavier towards pitching than they have been in the past, simply to kind of restock the system and give you the arms you need to get through a full season. You saw what happened with Hunter Brown last year when he had the biggest workload of his entire life and the couldn't necessarily sustain it for an entire season. So be on the lookout for that. But I feel good about the future of this system, even if right now it's not the deepest system in the world. I feel good about Dana Brown's ability to go out and get guys that y'all can maximize and make into quality major leaguers or trade pieces. Wrapping up the show, again, great conversation with Brett. Really enjoyed it. Never really got to that pitching conversation. Again, I'll throw that comparison into Monday's mailbag, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, if you have questions for Monday's mailbag, I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball, show's on Twitter at Locked On Farm. All of the rest of the ways to reach us in the episode description, in the show notes. Also down there, a podcast survey. I'm trying to get your input on what you like, what you don't like, and what we should do differently in 2024. So let me hear from you. Until then, remember, it's always a great time to pay a minor leaguer.